So let's talk about two huge forces that literally shaped the world we live in today, the Cold War and decolonization. Right after World War II, these two massive movements crashed into each other, and the result? Decades of conflict, a redrawn global map, and the very foundations of our modern world. Let's dive right in. You know, this quote from former German Chancellor Willy Brandt, it just nails it. The Cold War wasn't only about physical barriers like the Berlin Wall, it was really about the walls in the mind. It was a war fought with ideas, and those ideas would divide the entire planet for generations.
All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with how the old world order got shaken up after World War II, which leads us straight into the crazy superpower rivalries. At the very same time, we'll look at this huge push for independence happening all over the globe. Then we'll see how all this played out, politically, economically, and socially, and wrap up by looking at the global institutions that were born out of all this chaos. So, let's kick things off with those challenges to the old ways of doing things. You'd think the end of World War II would mean peace, right? Well, not exactly. Instead, it just blew up the old power structures and created a totally new and deeply divided world stage. Think of it like this. The old European empires were crumbling, leaving this giant power vacuum. And who jumped in to fill that void? Yep, the United States and the Soviet Union. You could see this ideological clash playing out immediately in Germany, which was literally split in two, a democratic West and a Soviet-controlled East. It set the tone for a divided continent. So, how did the US plan to deal with Soviet influence? With one big overarching policy, containment. And let me tell you, this wasn't some short-term plan. It became the central pillar of American foreign policy for decades. The goal was simple: stop communism from spreading, no matter what it took. This whole conflict basically carved the world up into three distinct parts. You had the first world, that's the US and its allies, then the second world, the Soviet Union and its communist partners, and then, so importantly, you had the third world. These were often brand new nations, just shaking off colonial rule, and now they were stuck, trying to navigate this new world between two giants who wanted them on their team. So this division didn't just stay on paper, it escalated, and fast, into a full-blown superpower rivalry. We're not talking about a simple disagreement here. This was a period of unbelievable constant tension that had the entire planet holding its breath, right on the edge of another world war. You've probably heard the phrase Iron Curtain, right? Winston Churchill coined it, and man, did it perfectly capture the situation. It split Europe right down the middle. On one side, a democratic West, on the other, a communist East. But this wasn't just a line on a map. It was a deep, dark wall of mistrust. And what grew in that darkness? Something truly terrifying: the nuclear arms race. Get this, by the 1980s, the US and the Soviet Union each had more than 10,000 strategic nuclear weapons. Just try to wrap your head around that. It led to this absolutely bone-chilling doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. A fitting acronym, right? It basically meant, if we launch, you launch, and we all get wiped off the face of the earth. To make things official, both sides formed massive military alliances. You had NATO in the West, led by the US, and the Warsaw Pact in the East, led by the Soviets. And these weren't just political clubs. No, this was a hard promise. An attack on one is an attack on all. And just like that, Europe turned into a giant armed camp, with millions of soldiers staring each other down. But here's the thing. While the superpowers were playing this dangerous game of global chess, a completely different, but just as powerful, movement was exploding around the world. All across Asia and Africa, people were standing up and demanding their freedom, challenging the very idea of colonial empires. See, World War II had left the old colonial powers pretty drained, and that just threw fuel on the fire for these independence movements. The wave started almost immediately after the war, with India and Pakistan in 1947, and then, wow, in the 50s and 60s, it just crested, as dozens of new nations, especially in Africa, declared their independence.
And just look at the sheer scale of this transformation. In about half a century, the number of independent countries in the world more than doubled. That is incredible. We're not just talking about new flags and redrawn borders. This was a fundamental reordering of power on a global scale.
So you have these two massive forces, the Cold War and decolonization. What happens when they smash into each other? Well, tragically, it got ugly. Local struggles for freedom got sucked into the superpower vortex, and all of a sudden, these new nations became brutal battlegrounds for proxy wars. And this is what that looked like. These became the hotspots of the Cold War, where the superpowers used other countries as pawns in their game. In Asia, it meant absolutely devastating wars in Korea and Vietnam. In Africa, you had countries like Angola torn apart, and in Latin America, the US often supported brutal dictatorships, all in the name of keeping the Soviets out.
Okay, so moving beyond the battlefields, how did this global standoff actually affect regular people's lives? Because this deep ideological split, it wasn't just about governments. It created completely different economic and social realities for millions and millions of people.
Economically, you had two totally different worlds. In the West, fueled by things like the Marshall Plan, free market economies were booming. But in the East, the state-controlled economies just struggled. And when the Berlin Wall finally came down, that transition away from communism was incredibly painful for a lot of people, with massive unemployment and economic chaos.
So communism was promising equality and support for everyone. The West had to compete with that idea. And what was their answer? The welfare state. The logic was, hey, if we provide things like public health care and strong social safety nets, we can prove our system is better for ordinary people. And that's how you end up with the widespread healthcare coverage we see in places like Denmark and the UK.
We can't forget the staggering human cost in all of this. We're talking millions dead in those proxy wars. An entire generation lived under the constant shadow of nuclear war, and the repression was real, on both sides. In the US, you had the Red Scare ruining people's lives over accusations of being a communist. In the Soviet bloc, speaking out against the state could get you sent to a prison camp, or worse.
And even after all those nations gained their independence, the legacy of colonialism stuck around in powerful ways. Language is a perfect example. The fact that millions of people across Africa still speak French or Portuguese or English, that's a direct echo of a colonial past that doesn't just vanish overnight.
So, what happens when the Cold War finally sputters out? That old world order, split between two superpowers, just disappears. The world had to pivot, and it had to create a whole new framework built on something different: global cooperation. This is where big global institutions like the United Nations and the World Trade Organization really came into their own. The focus shifted. It wasn't about us versus them anymore. It became about tackling huge shared problems that no single country could solve on its own. Things like climate change, human rights, and global pandemics. This whole journey, from division to cooperation, brings us right to our doorstep with a really crucial question for our time. As we face the massive challenges of the 21st century, are those institutions we built after the Cold War strong enough to hold? Or are we starting to see new walls go up? That's something for all of us to think about. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.